Hello, and welcome to Ars Lyrica's Musical Moments. Today, we're looking at mapping the music of Handel, a great composer and keyboard player. I'm Kathleen Staten, your host for today. My goal is to help connect the dots between somebody who lived 400 years ago and yourself. Sometimes it can be hard to find relevance in music that doesn't seem to be part of our daily lives, and to find a connection between the people who wrote it and the people who they wrote it for. So what do you know about George Frideric Handel? Maybe you know that he was a contemporary of Bach. Actually, he and Johann Sebastian Bach were born on the same day. Maybe you know that he was from the Baroque period, a time period lasting from the mid-1600s into the early 1700s. Maybe you know he was born in Germany. Maybe you know that he wrote one of the most famous choral works of all time, the Messiah. But what else is there to know? Let's take a look. It might be hard to feel like you have much in common with a man in a powdered white wig who looks like he came from a time capsule. But it turns out that he was actually a superstar of his day, kind of like Lady Gaga or even Renee Fleming, people who were able to cross genres and styles and could do just about anything that they set their mind to. Handel wrote in all styles of music, and in fact, it's been quoted by Sir Thomas Beecham as saying, he wrote Italian music better than the Italians, French music better than any Frenchman, and English music better than any Englishman. With the exception of Bach, he outrivaled all Germans. So why was he so highly rated? Well, it turns out that his personality was just as big as his music. Whether you're looking for the high-spirited instrumental music like the Concerto Grosso or the most poignant and emotional of operas, Handel was your man. He was also your man if you like to gossip, eat a lot, and drink even more. In fact, this famous caricature was drawn of Handel after an argument with somebody about whether or not he would write a composition, and here it depicts just how pig-headed he could be in his eloquent rhetoric as well as in his consumption. So how do you become a superstar? How do you have fame spread worldwide? How do you cross all of the genres and styles? Well, people today like Kanye West and, like I mentioned before, Lady Gaga, are able to do it with publicists and internet and radio, every kind of media imaginable. So how did Handel become the star that he was? Let's take a look at his beginnings, his very humble beginnings in a small town in Saxony. As is the case with many stories of composers, there was a parental figure who was not in support of a career in music. It was not lucrative, it was just not a good idea. His father, Handel's father, wanted him to study law. His father was actually a barber surgeon and was hoping to guarantee a better life for Handel. Handel, however, had a deep-seated love for music and other ideas. There's a great story about how somehow Handel was able to sneak a small keyboard instrument called a clavichord up through his house to the attic, and if that wasn't enough of a feat, he would sneak up there in the middle of the night to practice. Now, this all happened when he was less than 10 years old, and the reason we know this is because when he was 8, apparently he jumped up on the console of the organ after church and performed. Can you imagine sneaking this metal instrument up and playing it in secret? A clavichord, similar to a harpsichord, had strings that were plucked. They were made of a soft metal, and this instrument was primarily meant for practicing. It was not ever going to be played in a large ensemble, but I still can't imagine getting away with midnight practicing. It was rumored that a duke was present at Handel's little concert and wanted to sponsor this talented young musician. It was then that, age 8, Handel began to study composition, keyboard, and even some violin with a local organist at the church in Halle named Zachow. He studied with him for 3 years, after which time Handel had learned everything he could from this teacher. Unfortunately, also at this time, Handel's father passed away. A little bit like Salieri in the very famous movie Amadeus. When Handel's father died, so did the mandate that he must study law. He honored his father's wishes as his education had been provided for. After that, though, the call of music was just too strong and he moved to Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg proved to be an important time in Handel's life. Just like when you go away to college, it's an opportunity to make connections and to meet people. It was also one of the only places in Germany outside of a court where there was an opera house. And as we know, opera was soon to become a very big part of Handel's compositional output. During the time in Hamburg, he was employed in an orchestra. He was at the back of the violin section, and he also assumed some duties as a harpsichord player. He met there Johann Mattheson, who was to become a longtime friend, and he was a very famous theorist. He also got into a duel with Handel, and also Dietrich Buxtehude, a very famous organist also from Germany. It is from Hamburg, though, that the grand tour truly begins. In case you don't know, a grand tour was something that a noble young man would be able to take part in to broaden his understanding of the world around him. There were several major cities in Europe, and gentlemen would travel throughout. The only other way to do that was if the aristocracy or church patrons invited you to come to their city. And that is exactly what happened for George Frideric Handel. After about 4 years in Hamburg, a very famous duke in Florence invited him to come down and visit. Fernando de' Medici came from a long line of arts and music loving people. In fact, he sponsored many musicians, including the 22-year-old Handel. Handel spent several years there experimenting with tonality and harmony, and it was during this time period that we first begin to see a major output in oratorios. Now, oratorios and opera can sometimes be a bit confusing. You might go to an opera that's semi-staged or not staged. Well, that's really what an oratorio is. And sometimes oratorios are staged with costumes and some action, which is much more like an opera. But generally, the dividing line was that operas were on texts that were more secular or dealing with human emotions and experiences, while oratorios were generally on sacred texts. Opera was the rage throughout Europe. However, in Germany especially, where opera could not be performed during Lent, oratorio was a wonderful substitute for the drama of singing and acting and music. You may be wondering why I'm talking about oratorio and opera when this is a program on Handel's keyboard works. Well, it was precisely during these oratorios that the first organ concertos were performed. They were performed usually in the space between halves. Handel's works were often broken up into 2 or 3 parts, and in the middle was when he would demonstrate his skill at the organ. Handel's very first oratorio was composed in 1707 and was written with a cardinal who wrote the libretto for him, and it was called The Triumph of Time and Truth. This is a particularly interesting keyboard work that we're going to hear because it is our own Matthew Durst who wrote the reconstruction of this piece. You may know some of the other famous concertos are from Opus 4, Opus 7, but this was a piece that Matthew put together from many different sources. Handel was a composer who wrote so many different versions. He would tailor singing parts to a specific singer who was going to appear in a specific city. He would reorchestrate pieces. He would borrow music of his own and music from his contemporaries to inspire his works. In fact, if you go look on Wikipedia, one of my favorite sources, you can actually see from whom he borrowed for each one of his organ concerti. But this is from Opus 46, and we're going to hear Matthew Durst performing on the organ at St. Philip Church here in Houston, Texas. Now, this organ is not specifically like the organs that Handel would have had, and we'll talk about that as we go along. There were a couple of different styles of organ playing. One was the very German style that had a lot to do with the church, and that involved both keyboards and the pedals. However, there were many smaller organs that were used, portatif organs that were meant to be able to be transported, and oftentimes those did not have pedals. They were used to play continuo, or sort of the backup harmony part in orchestras, along with harpsichords, and then those were the kinds of instruments that Handel would have used to play his concertos. So it was a much more simple registration or choosing of the sounds and the stops that the organ has. But Matthew brings that to life as best as he can on this beautiful organ in St. Philip Church. What did you think? Is that what you had in mind when I said we would hear an organ concerto? Well, a concerto by nature is usually a solo piece showing off an instrument or sometimes a group of instruments that is accompanied by an orchestra. And again, this concerto is one that Matthew believes would have been played at the intermission of Handel's first oratorio, written in Florence. This is one of the things I love most about historical performance. It is so much more than just learning the notes on the page and being competent at your instrument. You become a detective of sorts, just like Matthew, piecing together clues from a variety of sources that continue to be discovered that shed light on how the music was performed and lost works that we would have no access to without the scholarship of people like Matthew. Handel spent about 7 years in Italy before it was time for him to move on. Now, we're skipping over vast amounts of information and connections here, but what's important to know is that all of the courts of Europe were interlinked, especially Germany and England at that time. And it was important for dukes and other royalty to sort of musically spy on each other and know who had the best composers and who was able to offer the greatest spectacles in opera. And it was there, actually, when Handel was in Italy, that he was connected with two people from England who would become very important, one being an ambassador. And he was invited to come to England. Again, this is part of that grand tour idea that any cultured person would go and embark on a great exploration of the major centers of culture throughout Europe. Of course, Rome in Italy, and then also to England and throughout Germany. The reason that Handel was invited was the success of his operas. Italian opera was the height, the pinnacle of the style of Baroque opera at this time. The displays of virtuosity and the amazing depth of emotion that was on display related to everybody. In fact, it's one of the reasons that we still love to produce Baroque opera today. There's something so tangible and relatable about the characters and how they explore their feelings and experiences on the stage in Baroque opera. So it is that exactly that takes Handel to England. He goes at the invitation of a duke again and finds himself in London. Handel wrote a tremendous amount of music while in London. He had written a few operas, but during the time he was there, he actually composed more than 25. He was also busy writing works that were specifically commissioned from him, including the Chandos anthems and Ode for St. Cecilia's Day. It's that I'd like to talk about now. We're skipping several years ahead in his tenure in London, but Alexander's Feast was a very important piece for Handel. Two of the first organ concertos to actually be advertised were done so for performances at Covent Garden, and they were alongside Esther, one of Handel's very famous oratorios, and the audience described them as being some of the finest things that they had ever heard in their entire life. Handel was known to have an odd style of performing. He wasn't like Bach. Bach had a church job, and he stayed primarily in the area in which he was born. Bach's keyboards are well known because that was the primary source of his composition and also his displays of virtuosity. For Handel, as I mentioned at the beginning, he had many skills and performed on many instruments, and so we don't have the same kind of focus and concentration on these sources. Here's a picture of the organ as it appeared in Covent Garden at the time of Handel. From this time on, almost without exception, there were organ concertos performed at the break in all of Handel's oratorios, including the Messiah. In the catalog of Handel's organ concerti, the very first one that appears is Opus 4, number 1, which is in G minor. Let's take a listen to that now. I mentioned before that Handel was a man of big personality and that the drama was not just in his music, but also in his life. Handel played organs that were all over the city. We still have some pictures and also the registrations or the kinds of pipes that were available on these organs. Handel became quite particular about having quality instruments. In fact, when he traveled to Dublin, Ireland to have the premiere of his Messiah, he brought his own organ with him. Now, noteworthy about Messiah is that Handel himself was not actually at the organ for the performance. He would have been conducting from the harpsichord, and then there was an additional organ player. However, during the intermissions of this very famous piece, Handel would have absolutely changed keyboards and performed for the audiences there. Once he got to London, there were, of course, politics about who was performing where, who got the best musicians, and then, of course, a rivalry between the court-sponsored opera house and the more people's opera. So it was then that Handel wrote the Oratorio, Israel in Egypt. The style of this oratorio was to set the stage for Messiah. It was reliant very much on the chorus instead of just on the soloists, and is rich with text painting. Now, the reason that this is significant for his keyboard work is because the keyboard concerto that was likely performed at the break in Israel and Egypt was also filled with text or sound painting. The Cuckoo and the Nightingale is one of my favorite organ concertos. Handel wrote this, and it recalls the sound of birds. Let's take a listen and see what you think. So, while George Frideric Handel was not most known for his keyboard virtuosity or for his organ works, it's very noteworthy to take a look at his output because it was his concerti that shaped the style for this genre going forward. The concerto itself was a novel thing, something that people hadn't been exposed to yet. In fact, it was new to the Baroque period altogether, this idea of having a single instrument displaying virtuosity. For more information on Handel and some really engaging activities, take a look at the link in the comments for supplementary materials that I put together for you. I hope you've enjoyed this little foray into the keyboard music of Handel. If you have any questions, please contact us at info@arslyricahhouston.org, or you can contact me directly at kstaten@arslyricahhouston.org. We hope you'll tune in again for more musical moments from Ars Lyrica. This concerto is the one that was likely performed at the interlude of Alexander's Feast. It is noteworthy, the improvisatory style that you hear. You might notice the outline of the chords by the orchestra, and then the very free and wildly changing harmonies that are happening in the organ part. A lot had changed in Handel's understanding of music and also in his own ability from the time of the reconstruction that Matthew Durst did to this performance.